finish this war in one last video. We're ready for the final island hopping that squeezes in upon Japan, and eventually we win World War II and the whole tragedy is over. When we left off, we were discussing how the battles of Coral Sea and Midway set us up for success in the Pacific Ocean. Remember, the root problem of Japan up here is resources. They needed to conquer China to get resources. That has actually been going poorly for Japan since 1931 because China has 1 billion people to soak up Japanese bullets, which are resources. The fall of France to Germany allowed Japan to take over French Indochina, which is Vietnam, which gave them rubber resources. That helps. England being brutalized by the Nazis in the Battle of Britain and the war in Europe allows Japan to take over some oil regions here, but what they really need is Australia, which we blocked at the Battle of the Coral Sea, a battle that's also important because it proves once and for all the aircraft carrier will win World War II. It is the first naval battle in history in which the ships never saw each other because it was fought completely by airplanes. Of course, the tragedy there was one of our 3 aircraft carriers, the Yorktown, was crippled and had to be towed all the way back to Hawaii for repairs, which is supposed to take 90 days. And in that 90 days, Japan needs to launch the Battle of Midway. If they can capture Midway, they can bomb Hawaii every single day, they can bomb Pearl Harbor every single day, and we can't repair ships like the Yorktown or launch future invasions of Japan or any islands over here. And so they try to suck us into the trap of Midway. We break their code, we reverse the trap and surprise attack the entire Japanese Navy off of Midway, and it's us destroying their Navy in this case. We basically Pearl Harbored them in this case. We wiped out their aircraft carriers. Their airplanes in the air had no place to land, and so they crashed and we wiped out their pilots. The Japanese Navy will never recover from the Battle of Midway. They will not have time to train pilots for future battles, and we will dominate the air for the rest of the Pacific War. So all we have to do from this point is march our army, which has been gathering in Australia, up islands. That's why it's called island hopping. We don't have to invade every single island, just the important ones. The army under MacArthur will go from Australia up through New Guinea, up through the Philippines to Okinawa, and eventually we will D-Day style invade Japan as the goal, while the U.S. Marine Corps starts in Guadalcanal and goes up to Saipan and goes to Iwo Jima and also prepares to invade Japan D-Day style. These close islands up here, Okinawa and Iwo Jima, once we capture those, we can bomb Japan every single day the way they planned on bombing Pearl Harbor from Midway. And you got to keep this in mind to really understand this. I know at least one person will ask this on the discussion forum. The atomic bomb does not exist at this point. Nobody has any inkling, no idea, no even imagination that the atomic bomb is even possible, except for a few secret scientists and the President Franklin Roosevelt. It's just not on our minds at this point. What we see is a war where we have to D-Day style invade island after island after island after island, and eventually do that to Japan, and it's going to be very painful, and it's going to be very costly. In fact, that is the Japanese strategy in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor did not live up to their expectations. It taught us how to win the war, and Midway certainly made them realize that they could not win the war militarily against us. This leaves Japan with one strategy. Remember, nobody respects American power at this point. Nobody respects American willpower at this point, or fortitude. We do not have an amazing military history. The American Revolution was us against England, but we had help from France and from Spain and from Prussia and actually some other countries. And so it really doesn't represent American power. Then we had the war against Mexico, which is like attacking a kindergarten. Nobody noticed the Civil War, which was an outstanding display of American willpower and fortitude, but it's a civil war. Nobody out in the world noticed that. They noticed the Spanish-American War of 1898, where America went and kicked over the Spanish wheelchair inside of a nursing home and took their empire, like the Philippines, to get our gas station islands across the Pacific. And they noticed World War I, where America comes in, fights for 6 months, loses 700 guys a day, for a total of 133,000 dead Americans in 6 months of World War I, including my great-uncle Jim's legs from Mineth. The Japanese have no respect for our military power. They believe that as we invade island by island, they know they can't save these soldiers. They know they can't reinforce these soldiers. They can't resupply these soldiers. They can't even feed their soldiers on these islands. In fact, on New Guinea, which has almost no native population because it's such an inhospitable living area, that the Japanese platoons are drawing straws to determine which soldier would be killed and eaten that day for dinner. They had hundreds of thousands of guys on New Guinea with no food supplies coming to them. They realized the only possible hope they have is to make this war so painful and so bloody that America loses our willpower and quits. Literally, they're going to try to bleed us to death. The soldiers are told, you're going to die on that island, kill 10 Americans before you go down, hoping to make America quit. The Japanese turn to more atrocities during these island-hopping battles. They intentionally target the medics. If you're fighting the Germans in Europe, if you're at the Battle of the Bulge, or even on D-Day, if you had the Red Cross on your helmet, that you were a medic, that you were a humanitarian soldier rather than a combat soldier, the Germans did not intentionally target you. They followed what's called the rules of war. The Japanese want to make this as bloody as possible, and they realize if you kill the medics, then 10 more soldiers and Marines die because they don't get medical attention. And so Japan intentionally targets the medics during this battle. They were brutalizing our POWs to try to break the willpower of our fighting men, because the word gets out that how horribly you're treated as a prisoner of war. They were executed, they were tortured, they were just brutalized, and in some cases they were eaten by the Japanese on these islands to try to scare our guys from fighting the war, break the American willpower, and get America to just quit World War II, and that's the only chance Japan has. What they didn't calculate was just the absolute willpower of Franklin Roosevelt to pursue this war to unconditional surrender. We were not going to negotiate our way out of this war. We were not going to let the Japanese negotiate their way out of this war, because we had learned from World War I that when you negotiate a peace, the loser isn't really beaten, and they will always claim they can win the war again. They'll always want to redo. So our goal, our willpower, is actually unconditional surrender. We're going to beat the Japanese down until they beg us to quit. And then they can never, ever, ever say, well, we could have won this war. Alright, so examples of the island hopping. This would have been a great thing in class to do, because this is why we did those battle posters. But Guadalcanal is the first exposure of Americans to combat in the Pacific. I'm going to do a little bit of switching around here back and forth just so you can see where things are. If we were in the classroom, I'd have the map pulled down and the screen up and the posters. So we win Coral Sea here. Guadalcanal is part of the Solomon Islands here. And it's one of the first island hopping things we will do. It's launched by the United States Marine Corps. One of the odd things about the American military that gave us an advantage in World War II is the U.S. Marine Corps. The U.S. Marine Corps has existed since the American Revolution, and what Marines essentially are combatants that ride on ships, and so they're part of the U.S. Navy. And what this sets up America for is, I've told you 1,000 times, you can't win a two-front war, but America literally has two land fighting forces. While the U.S. Army is invading North Africa in November of 1942, the U.S. Marines can take off against Japan, and it's the Marine Corps that invades Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is not a really big island, maybe the size of a St. Genevieve County or two. What we learned very quickly on Guadalcanal is the Japanese were there to die. They wanted to kill as many of us as possible. It took us 6 months to take Guadalcanal. It cost us 23,000 American dead, and we had to kill 36,000 Japanese on that island. 6 months. Remember, Hitler took France in 6 weeks. He took Poland in 2 weeks. It took us 6 months to gain control of an island the size of St. Genevieve County, maybe a little bit bigger. This is our first indication that World War II was going to be brutal. And we're talking in detail about casualties here because the closer we get to Japan, the more brutal these casualties get, the more desperate Japan gets. Remember, we don't know the atomic bomb is possible at this point. We believe every island on the way to Japan, and then Japan will be a matter of a D-Day style invasion where soldiers and Marines jump off the Higgins boats and charge those beaches just like at the beginning of Saving Private Ryan. It's going to be just a brutal, brutal process. The next big one is Saipan. The Marines take Guadalcanal. Another bloody one they fight here is Bougainville, and they come up through Tarawa, and then they take Saipan here, a little bit of zigzagging. Tarawa was important for supplies. This is where Richard Nixon served in the U.S. Army during World War II. From Tarawa, you could bring stuff from Pearl and then divert it to Australia or the Philippines or Saipan. It's a good staging area. What Nixon did specifically was he was an officer that took care of the supplies and got them distributed across the Pacific theater, and then he loaded those same planes or ships full of American bodies to be sent home. So Nixon had a real grim type of job during World War II. And from Tarawa, the Marines pop up to Saipan, which is another one of these classic island hopping battles. We'll come back to this picture here. It's hard to make out, but this is the unique thing about Saipan. It's a Pacific island with rocky cliffs like this high above the water, and the Japanese people on Saipan are told by the army, the Japanese army, that the Americans are the bad guys. And if you surrender to the Americans, you're less than human, and the Americans will treat you horribly. They will torture you, they will rape and pillage you. Basically what the Japanese have been doing to people that surrender them for 10, 12 years by this point. But they brainwashed the Japanese people into thinking we were truly the bad guys. And so as we liberate the island from these atrocious Japanese ideas, we discovered the civilians on Saipan were jumping off the cliffs to kill themselves and throwing their babies off the cliffs so that their babies would not be captured by the Americans. They'd rather commit suicide than surrender to the Americans. And this is a key point to understand how serious the Japanese are about this war. They would rather die than surrender. The casualties here are so lopsided. 3,400 Marines are killed on Saipan, but we had to kill 27,000 Japanese people on Saipan. What this tells us is the closer we get to Japan, the less they're going to be willing to surrender. They're going to fight to the absolute death, which means more Americans are going to die, and they're hoping that we will just give up and quit. Leyte Gulf is actually the Philippines, and that's where we switch from the Marines to Army operations. Douglas MacArthur, remember, was God in the Philippines before World War II. The Filipino people worshipped him. He is the most senior American officer, and he wanted to fight and die at the Battle of Corregidor, be the last American fighting on the Philippines. But Franklin Roosevelt made him leave, and so he took a giant speedboat ride to the southern Philippines and then airplaned to Western Australia, and then he took a train across the outback to civilized Australia, and now he's got to fight his way all the way back. We were able to stockpile massive amounts of soldiers on Australia, plus the Australians were helping us, and the British were there too. He invades New Guinea here, where there are hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers. If somebody would ask on the discussion forum, I would share a pic of how brutal New Guinea was. I have my children's great-grandfather, my wife's grandfather, fought from Australia to New Guinea, and he has pictures of the natives of New Guinea trading Japanese heads for cigarettes. That's how brutal the war is out here, and I can show you pictures of that if somebody would remind me in the discussion forum. We would have passed the photo album around in class. And then MacArthur marches up to the Philippines, where he's promised his men, "I shall return." He had to surrender 75,000 guys on the Philippines after he left, and they suffered that atrocious Bataan death march and were just killed, tortured, and executed. And I'll refer again to the St. John native, Joe Wolfe, was there for all of that. Those guys were eventually transferred to Japan to be slave labor in Japan during the war. If you watch the movie Unbroken, it's what that's all about. So Leyte Gulf is our invasion of the Philippines by Douglas MacArthur. And it's another unique example of how desperate things were for the Japanese. MacArthur made sure he was pictured here returning, jumping off one of the boats directly. But the most famous thing about Leyte Gulf, it's the biggest invasion we'd launched so far. This was actually bigger than D-Day. And the Japanese are so desperate, this is where they started the famous use of kamikaze. Remember, the Battle of Midway destroyed their best aircraft carriers and their best airplanes and their best pilots. It takes about 4 years to learn how to really fly an airplane. It takes about 2 years of training to become competent as an aviator. Flying airplanes is not, it's not impossibly difficult. On your first lesson, literally, you can get the airplane off the ground. I know I tell this story all the time, because all you literally have to do is get it steered so that it points down the runway, push in the throttle, keep the steering wheel straight and stay on the runway. When you hit 55 miles an hour, it's going to get the physics of lift. It's going to go in the air. Once you're in the air, it's like driving a car. It's just literally that easy, except you got some up and down going on, which is no big deal. You're 5,000 feet up, 10,000 feet up in a small airplane at most, and you just got to worry about some up and down. You got to watch for the traffic around you. And that's the part that takes a couple years to get used to, is watching for the traffic and becoming competent at flying that airplane. And landing. Landing is quite the challenge, actually. And so it takes about 2 years to become competent, but the wild card here about war is it's easy. Anybody can get an airplane and just fly around, but now add in the idea that other airplanes are trying to kill you. That takes about another 2 years of training. So it's a 4-year commitment to really make a combat pilot. And Japan lost their best combat pilots at the Battle of Midway. And so they're in this awful position of they don't have time to train competent pilots. If they trained pilots enough to fight us, they would not have enough time to get the experience to beat us. So every bit of investment in training good pilots would be lost if Japan tried that. And so I know this is probably hard to see. It made more efficient sense to teach young Japanese how to be pilots, but not spend, they don't have 4 years. They don't even have 2 years to make them competent. But in a few weeks, they can get them off the ground and flying an airplane around, and then just give them orders to crash their airplane into the American aircraft carriers. That is still the target. It's been the target since Pearl Harbor. That was the target at Midway. Destroy the American aircraft carriers, and then our pilots have no place to land, and we have no way to get planes close enough to Japan to bomb them. Except we're taking island by island. They're hoping to stop us from taking the island hopping and getting close to Japan. And so we were really just freaked out at Leyte Gulf because of the kamikaze, which means divine wind in the Japanese language. What Japan has believed in ever since ancient days is that the gods are on their side. Every time China tried to invade Japan in the ancient world, a divine wind would blow up a kamikaze and shove the Japanese or the Chinese Navy back away from Japan. Japan literally believed the gods were on their side, and so it didn't matter if they had better ships, better airplanes, or more resources. They truly believed they would win this war just because God was on their side. And what we learned in World War II is you win by firepower. When we have 50 airplanes for every one Japanese airplane, well, we're going to win. And so we're freaked out at Leyte Gulf with the kamikaze. It doesn't do much damage. An airplane coming straight at a ship is very easily shot down by the defensive gunners on that ship, by the anti-aircraft machine gunners. It freaked us out. Didn't do a whole lot of damage. It just impresses upon us how serious Japan was. Another good example of how serious Japan was, a little nugget here at the bottom of Leyte Gulf. First standing orders of any soldier is never leave your post until properly relieved. If you're on guard duty, you don't leave guard duty until another soldier comes and properly relieves you. As we started taking over the Philippines, it's jungles, it's mountains, there's literally 10,000 different Philippine islands. The Japanese army scatters into the jungles of the Philippines, and one squad of about 5 guys, they just keep on fighting. And nobody told them the war was over, nobody came to relieve them. One by one they died until the very last one surrenders in 1974, which is 30 years after World War II was over, and even then, he was like a legend of Bigfoot at that point. He was finally found and would not surrender until America went and got his former commanding officer in World War II, brought him to the Philippines, and ordered him to stand down. On my website, there's a bunch of links down lower on the webpage. It's gotten shoved down, and it's got the story of this guy. And then he becomes a motivational speaker in Japan and sort of lives happily ever after. This should give you an idea of just how serious the Japanese are. And the closer we get to Japan, the more serious they're going to get. Iwo Jima is probably the most famous example of this entire process. It has the most famous picture of World War II. Iwo Jima, we've gone from Australia to the Philippines. The Marines have gone from Guadalcanal up through Tarawa, through Saipan, and Iwo Jima's here. Iwo Jima is close enough that we can launch bombers from Saipan, and we can launch some bombers from the Philippines. But Iwo Jima puts us close enough to escort those bombers with smaller fighter airplanes, and it gives us a nice closer place so the bombers aren't so stressed out flying 24-hour missions back and forth to Japan. It gives a crash landing place for crippled bombers, and it's Japan's last radar defense. Okinawa and Iwo Jima sort of make a ring here. Once we get bombers on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, we can fly to Japan and they never know we're coming. Plus, our bombers are better defended, and we can just start blowing the ever-living crap out of Japan on a daily basis. We literally, in the end, we end up killing more Japanese with regular bombs than the atomic bombs could ever dream of. So Iwo Jima is extremely strategic. It is a very, 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 very tiny island, but the Japanese are going to tenaciously hold on to it, and it becomes almost the most bitter battle of the Pacific. It's 8 square miles. It's smaller actually than just the town of St. Genevieve, and it's long and thin. It's 4 miles long and only 2 miles wide. And on one end there's an ancient volcano, a dormant volcano called Mount Suribachi, and the Japanese have spent years digging into Mount Suribachi, building apartments inside and hospitals inside. And because it's a volcanic island, lava rock is very soft if you've ever touched it. They have tunnels throughout the entire island, and they've really set up the perfect defense here for what they want to do. They just want to kill Americans. They're hoping to make Iwo Jima so bloody that we would just quit. To give you an idea of how serious we were, we bombed Iwo Jima for 72 straight days. We blew every blade of grass off that island. Before the Marines come in, the Navy spent 3 days pounding Iwo Jima with their 16-inch battleship guns. There were Marines that hoped that all the Japanese were dead by the end of this. It looked like the moon. It was a moonscape by the time we were done pre-bombing Iwo Jima. But here's the problem, that the Japanese have dug into caves and holes and interconnected tunnels throughout the island, so even if you killed all the Japanese in one machine gun tunnel, it's connected to others so they can replace those Japanese. It just becomes brutal on Iwo Jima, and it really relates to a lot of stuff going on today. I remember so specifically before America got involved in Syria, Obama was still president. He went on TV and says, yes, we're going to have to expand the war on terror. We've kind of wound down Iraq, but then we had to go back, and we're still fighting Afghanistan, but now we're going to have to go to Syria. But don't worry, we're just going to use airplanes, was what he said. And it was just laughable when he said it, because if we've learned anything from World War II, from modern military tactics, just airplanes don't cut it. In Afghanistan, and even into Iraq to some degree, the bad guys went underground. In Afghanistan especially, they went up in the caves, they went up in the mountains, and you can bomb and bomb and bomb. We have blown Afghanistan back to the Stone Ages in the past 20 years. The problem is they were in the Stone Ages and we started bombing them. In the end, war requires boots on the ground for soldiers and Marines to go into the caves, into the hideouts, and shoot the bad guys in the face. And that's what Iwo Jima comes down to. It didn't matter that we bombed it for 72 days straight, it just didn't do any damage. So these guys hit the beaches of Iwo Jima, and the Japanese had learned something from the Germans at this point. There's no stopping us. The Germans couldn't stop us at D-Day. We had more people than they had bullets, and so trying to kill us on the beaches was just sort of a waste of German bullets. What the Japanese learned was, let us land on the beaches. Because the American goal is to put more Marines on the beach than the Japanese have bullets. When you put that many Marines on the beach, there's going to be traffic jams. It's soft sand, it's soft lava rock sand. The tanks, the trucks, the jeeps get stuck. We're pouring in tens of thousands of guys on the beaches. There's traffic jams. And when the Americans get all clumped up, then you open fire. It really weirded some Americans out because they're landing on the beach. The first wave of Marines had accepted the idea that, I'm 19 years old and I'm going to die today, because the first wave, people just get slaughtered. They show up and nobody's shooting at them. Second and third wave comes in and nobody's shooting at them until later in the afternoon. The beaches are so clogged up with guys. Then the Japanese unleashed their slaughter upon the Marines in Iwo Jima. It was just devastating. By the fifth day, we have battled up Mount Suribachi, and I got to go backwards a little bit to find the most famous picture of World War II. Is the flag raising on top of Mount Suribachi by these 6 Marines. There are 6, even though you really can't tell. There's such a great story behind this. This inspired America and gave us hope that it was costing a lot of lives, it was costing a lot of money, but we were going to win World War II. This picture gave us that hope and re-inspired Americans to stick with it until the end.